In 1821, a man's home wasn't just his residence, it was his legal fortress. But what happens when the law is so obsessed with protecting your privacy that it accidentally protects your right to commit a murder? On a cold night in London's Drury Lane, a crowd of people stood in a narrow alleyway, listening to a woman being beaten to death just inches away. Among them was a police officer. He was armed, he had backup, and he knew exactly what was happening behind the door. Yet he didn't move. He couldn't, because in the eyes of the 19th century justice system, breaking down that door to save a life would have been a greater crime than the one happening inside. In the next 10 minutes, you will see how a legal loophole called the Castle Doctrine turned a neighborhood into a gallery of witnesses and a home into a death trap. To understand why the police stood still, you have to understand the coal yard. In 1821, this wasn't just a street. It was a labyrinth of poverty and desperation tucked away in London's Drury Lane. It was a place where private business was the only currency people had left. Inside one of these cramped rooms lived Matthew Welch and Mary Baker. On paper, they were just another couple trying to survive the London slums. But in the eyes of the law, their life was a scandal. Both were still legally married to other people. They were living in what was then called open adultery, a status that stripped them of many social protections, but, ironically, made their home a place where they wanted the world to stay out. They lived in a delicate balance until a knock at the door shattered it. It was Mary's legal husband coming to visit. We don't know what was said, but we know the result. When the husband walked away, he left behind a man consumed by a furious rage and a woman trapped with him in a room that was about to become a battlefield. As the argument between Welch and Mary escalated, it crossed the line from a private quarrel into something far more sinister. The thin walls of the coal yard were never meant for privacy. They acted like a megaphone for the violence unfolding inside. The sound of furniture being overturned was quickly replaced by what the records described as savage blows. This wasn't a quick flash of anger. It was a sustained, brutal assault. Mary's screams began to pierce the night air, echoing through the narrow alleyway and drawing a crowd of yarders, the local residents who lived packed together in the surrounding rooms. They gathered in the dark, listening to the rhythmic thud of violence. But this wasn't a neighborhood that ignored trouble. They did what any responsible citizen would do. They went to find the law. They found Mr. Haffan, the parish constable, and pleaded with him to stop the slaughter happening just behind the thin wooden planks of Welch's door. Mr. Haffan didn't arrive alone. He led a deputation of neighbors, essentially a small, authorized posse, to Welch's doorstep. At this moment, the law was inches away from the victim. Haffan hammered on the door, shouting through the wood, threatening to lock Welch up for causing a disturbance. But Matthew Welch knew something the neighbors didn't. He knew that as long as he stayed inside and kept the door barred, he held the high ground. Welch didn't surrender. Instead, he grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker and drove the crowd back from his threshold. He then slammed the door and threw the bolts. To the constable, this wasn't just a barricade, it was a legal wall. In 1821, without a specific warrant or the breaking of the king's peace being established under very narrow criteria, Haffan hesitated. If he forced the door and the situation was deemed a private domestic dispute, he could be sued, stripped of his position, or even imprisoned for trespass. So, the law stood on the cobblestones, poker-faced and paralyzed, while the screaming inside started again. What follows is perhaps the most haunting part of the historical record. Denied entry by a barricaded door and a rigid legal code, the neighbors and the constable became unwilling witnesses to an audio nightmare. They didn't need a confession. They had the live broadcast of a murder. Through the walls, they heard the savage blows continue, punctuated by Welch's curses. Then came the screams, terrible high-pitched cries for help that gradually lost their strength. The crowd outside stood in a localized purgatory. They were close enough to hear Mary Baker's life slipping away, yet legally miles apart. The record states that the screams finally died away until all was silence. In that sudden, heavy quiet, the evidence of a crime was complete, but the opportunity for a rescue was gone. The silence wasn't just the end of the struggle. It was the chilling realization that the invisible shield of the law had worked exactly as intended, protecting the occupant's privacy until there was no one left to protect. Why didn't they kick the door down? To a modern viewer, the constable's hesitation looks like cowardice or gross negligence. But in 1821, Mr. Haffan was caught in a trap of due process. At this time, the English common law followed a principle so strict it was almost religious. The house of everyone is to him as his castle and fortress. This wasn't just a metaphor, it was the law. Unless a felony was seen to be committed, or the constable had a specific warrant signed by a magistrate, forcing entry into a private home was a massive legal risk. The invisible shield here was the lack of what we now call exigent circumstances. Today, if a police officer hears screams, they can legally bypass the Fourth Amendment to prevent a death. But in Welch's time, the system prioritized the protection of this sanctity of the home from government overreach above almost everything else. The constable feared that if he broke the door and Mary was merely being beaten, not killed, he would be the one in handcuffs for violating Welch's property rights. The law protected the criminal's threshold so effectively that it effectively silenced the victim's plea for help. In the 1820s, the law viewed the night differently than the day. Darkness provided a literal and figurative cover for the Castle Doctrine. But as the sun began to rise over Drury Lane, the constable's legal paralysis finally thawed. Only with the return of daylight did the neighbors and Mr. Haffan dare to break into the house. The hesitation was over, but the tragedy was just beginning. They forced the door, expecting a confrontation, but they found something far worse: a silent room and a gruesome scene. Mary Baker was found with her brains battered in. The violence had been so extreme that there was no question of a private quarrel anymore. It was a cold, hard felony. But while the law had been waiting for the sun to rise to give them the right to enter, Matthew Welch hadn't been waiting at all. He had used the very darkness that protected his castle to slip out through a back window, disappearing into the maze of London's slums while the authorities stood guard at his front door. In most crime stories, this is where the killer flees into the wilderness or adopts a new identity. But Matthew Welch did something that defies modern logic. He didn't run into the shadows. He walked straight into the light of his other life. While the neighbors were staring in horror at the scene in the coal yard, Welch was making his way to Paddington. He arrived at the home of his real wife, the woman he had legally married before his life with Mary Baker. He didn't look like a man on the run. He didn't look panicked. He arrived, as the records say, coolly. He didn't hide in the attic or beg for a place to sleep. He demanded breakfast. This mundane act, sitting down for a meal with his legal wife while his mistress lay dead across the city, reveals a chilling psychological profile. Welch likely believed that because he had escaped the immediate scene and the constable hadn't seen him do it, he was still protected by the very system that had hesitated at his door. He wasn't just a killer. He was a man who understood the slow, clunky pace of 19th century justice. He ate his breakfast, finished his meal, and only then did he abscond into history, his whereabouts remaining a mystery to this day. The tragedy of Mary Baker wasn't just a failure of a few neighbors or a single constable. It was a failure of a legal philosophy that was no longer fit for a crowded, modern world. In 1821, the law was terrified of a police state. They remembered a time when the government could kick down any door for any reason, so they overcorrected. They built an invisible shield around the home, so strong that it shielded the murderer along with the innocent. This case, and others like it, became the catalyst for change. Only 8 years later, in 1829, Sir Robert Peel would establish the Metropolitan Police. The parish constable system, with its hesitant officers and limited powers, was scrapped. The law began to recognize the concept of exigent circumstances, the idea that a person's right to life is more sacred than a criminal's right to a locked door. We often think of legal progress as a series of grand speeches and noble documents. But more often, it is written in the blood of people like Mary Baker, victims who died because the system was too afraid of its own power to do the right thing. Matthew Welch was never caught. He vanished into the smog planet, a ghost created by a system that chose to look away when it should have looked within. Today, we take for granted that help will come if we scream. We trust that a badge has the power to cross a threshold in an emergency. But Mary Baker's story reminds us that the invisible shield of the law is a double-edged sword. It is designed to protect our liberty from the state, but when the rules become more important than the people they serve, the shield becomes a shroud. In the end, the law didn't fail to work in 1821. It worked perfectly, and that is the most disturbing part of the story.